Right now, thousands of highly paid people in Ontario's auto industry are preparing to hear the worst possible news. Sources inside government tell CBC News the General Motors plant in Oshawa is set to shut down. Now, we're learning this morning that GM and the Auto Workers Union will meet at 9:30 Eastern Time. So here's a look at the potential impact of all of this. There are 2,552 union jobs at the GM Oshawa plant. Those jobs are among the highest paying manufacturing jobs in the country. Several hundred non-union employees also work there. The GM Oshawa plant is a major hub for the auto sector, and a 2015 study for the Auto Workers Union estimates that as many as 29,000 jobs at parts makers and in the supply chain would be lost in a GM Oshawa shutdown. That same study estimates a $5 billion hit to Ontario's economy. We're doing a lot of digging on this story for you this morning, bringing you the very latest information as new details come to light. And you know, we're not the only people looking for answers. Oshawa's mayor is as well. He spoke to us on CBC Morning Live just last hour, and we talked about whether he's heard anything yet from General Motors.
Absolutely nothing. We're getting our information from the media. So we haven't been contacted, so we don't know what's going on.
Now, is that surprising to you? I mean, we've had reporting that there's been rumors in recent weeks that the plant has perhaps been in trouble, and it seems surprising that there would be absolutely no indication to the mayor that this would be imminent. You've heard nothing from the company.
Well, the plant's busy making pickup trucks. The reinvestment of hundreds of millions of dollars into the plant just a couple of years ago was a sign of how quickly the plant could shift and adapt. And our auto workers have done an amazing job to do that, and with technology here in Canada. So it was a little shocking to hear.
Let's take a look live at exactly what we're talking about. GM in Oshawa. And again, the history of this company in this community. It opened in 1907 as a manufacturing base for the Canadian McLaughlin Motor Car Company. So it's been a presence in the community for more than 100 years. And then General Motors purchased things about 11 years later. So the tradition, and very much synonymous with the auto industry in Canada, is this Oshawa plant. And Scott, as we look at it, what do we know of what's coming from an announcement today?
Yeah, this used to be the largest plant in Canada as well, 23,000 workers at one point. But what we know about this morning is there's going to be a 9:30 meeting between the union, about 2,500 workers there, and the management at General Motors. Now, we don't know what is going to be a formal announcement, whether we're going to hear after the 9:30 there's going to be some leaks and some updates from the union attending this meeting, or whether there's going to be a formal announcement as well by General Motors. But we know from an email to CBC, Unifor is saying that the announcement of a no product allocation as of December 2019 is not necessarily the same as a closure announcement. And we're trying to figure out why they're making that differentiation between the two. So lots of question marks about what's going to happen in this plant beyond December 2019 regardless. But this is what Unifor is saying in regards to what they know from General Motors, saying Unifor does not accept this announcement and is immediately calling on GM to live up to the spirit of that 2016 contract agreement where they would guarantee certain production. Unifor is scheduled to hold a discussion with General Motors Monday and will provide further comment following that meeting. So 9:30, that's what we're waiting for this morning, and we're going to wait to see what the union has to say, or if General Motors, and I've got calls out to everybody to find out what we're going to find out exactly at 9:30 and who's going to be saying it.
It's really interesting. Doug Ford, for example, the Ontario Premier, not saying anything at this time. Unifor, after the meeting, nothing from General Motors. There seems to be a real wait until they have some of these important initial discussions.
What's interesting about big business like this, and as slow as some people might think they move, it's very tight-lipped, and everybody across the board seems to be really caught by surprise about what GM is going to announce.
Okay, so stand by, Scott, because I'm going to come back to you in just a second as we take a look at the wider impact a GM shutdown would have from the community of Ottawa. But certainly the threat of those impact certainly have people looking to Ottawa, how the federal government plans to deal with whatever the news is to come from that meeting. Let's go to David Cochrane, who has more on the federal government, what we're hearing so far from the Trudeau government. David?
Yeah, Heather, nobody's speaking on the record right now, but last night I did speak with a senior government source that told me that the Trudeau government is obviously watching this situation very closely, quite concerned about this possible closure and end of production at the Oshawa plant. And the official said that the government will support the auto workers affected by any downturn at this plant, and the conversations to come up with some sort of a support plan, those have already started here in Ottawa. Now, the other thing the officials here are saying is they confirm that this is part of a global shift in production that won't just affect Ottawa and Oshawa, and operations here in Canada. Operations in other countries will be affected too, as General Motors makes a transition away from heavy vehicles to lighter and more fuel efficient and even electric vehicles. And that's a key point that the Canadian officials are making right now, Heather, that this is a company-driven thing, part of a larger corporate realignment. It appears to be separate and distinct from the trade tensions with the United States caused by the NAFTA negotiations, separate from the threat of tariffs from Donald Trump, a shift away from those heavier vehicles. So that's the message here right now. Of course, everything could change once that meeting starts at 9:30 and we get an official and formal statement from General Motors.
So the economy, very much a concern for the government with what's happening in the energy sector. Now this potentially, David, in what way is this a major political test for Justin Trudeau?
Well, it certainly turns upside down that economic narrative that the government was going with last week, that the economy is strong, so strong, in fact, it was delivering billions of extra dollars so they could cut taxes to help businesses invest and expand in machinery and equipment, including the manufacturing sector, which, of course, covers the auto sector. Now, here today, just a few days after the finance minister gave that glowing report card, 2,500 direct union jobs on the line, hundreds of management jobs on top of that. The Conservative MP for the area, Colin Carey, has sent out a statement estimating there are tens of thousands of feeder jobs in the supply chain that rely on that plant that could be lost. So the ripple effect of this is enormous, stacked on top of the anger in the oil patch in Western Canada, Saskatchewan, and more particularly in Alberta. You've got two key areas of the Canadian economy just being absolutely jolted as Ottawa has been doing a bit of a victory lap over GDP numbers and employment numbers. The other thing that sort of plays into this politically is the cast of characters that's involved here. Unifor, of course, the union that represents the workers there, Jerry Dias, the president, a big supporter of Justin Trudeau and the federal government during the NAFTA negotiations with the United States. He had their back. There's likely an expectation he's going to want the favor returned as we go through this transition in Oshawa. The other factor here, Heather, is Doug Ford, someone we've not heard from, does not get along with the Prime Minister, does not like Justin Trudeau. I think that feeling, it's safe to say, is reciprocated. Ministers and officials in that government bicker and squabble on everything from Twitter to television over all kinds of issues. They're now going to have to work together with tens of thousands of jobs in this area on the line. So it's going to be an interesting test for the Prime Minister in terms of how he responds to this in the absence of direct support for the Western Canadian oil sector in last week's fall economic statement, but also a test for Doug Ford to see if he can set aside his gripes and grievances with Justin Trudeau to maybe come up with some sort of a joint support plan, if not for this plant, then for the workers affected by it.
Okay, come back to the idea of the direct support, because I was just speaking to Ken Luenza, who used to be head of the Canadian Auto Workers Union, and he was at the time of the buyout. And we were talking about potential scenarios. Could they retool the plant, bring in another model at some other product? Would that require government money to do so? And Ken Luenza was saying everybody needs to be involved, all hands on deck to save this. So that begs the question, it may be premature in all of this, but would there be any discussions over a federal role in incentivizing GM to bring something new rather than just putting a padlock on the gate?
I have no hard information on that, but I would suggest that the notice that has been given is that there's no new production after the end of 2019. So you've got 13 months or so here, 12 months here to work out a solution. I would certainly expect a government that's willing to buy a pipeline to get it built would sit down and talk to the auto company to see if there's a way of keeping that plant open. And this is where the relationship with the Ontario government becomes critical, because they were both involved in the bailout of the auto sector 10 years ago, $13.7 billion in loans and stock purchases. Most of that got paid back. $3.5 billion has been written off, $2.5 billion to Chrysler, $1 billion to General Motors in bad debt. But I think if there is a chance to save this plant in some capacity, it would be irresponsible and political malpractice for the federal and provincial governments not to sit down and have some sort of a conversation with General Motors. But Heather, until we get the details of exactly what this restructuring plan means, if they're shifting to lighter vehicles and fuel-efficient vehicles, if they've already made capital investments or have a plan to produce that in another plant, particularly if it's in the U.S. with U.S. President Donald Trump and his protectionist stance, it's going to be a difficult conversation and a difficult sell, and there's no question of where that price tag could go. So we have no hard information on it, but I guarantee you they're willing to have a conversation.
Okay, David, thank you so much. Be back to you in an hour to see if there's any new reaction there in Ottawa. David Cochran gathering things in our Parliamentary Bureau. Right now, let's take a look at what GM is making. 4 different vehicles at the Oshawa plant. There's the Cadillac XTS, there's the Chevrolet Impala, and a couple of truck lines. It does the final assembly and paint on the Chevrolet Silverado and the GMC Sierra. So that's what it's looking at right now. And then as we bring back Scott, the talk about the pivot, this global restructuring. In the United States, interestingly, we got a recent announcement from GM that it's committing to a national zero emissions vehicle program. More than 7 million electric cars to the road by 2030. So talk about some of these realities and maybe business imperatives behind this switch.
Yeah, and this is what a little bit politics and a little bit economics is beyond all this. And, you know, the big question here is who's buying the XTS or the Impala? Are we going to see the capital investments start to move into Oshawa with this regearing as they go to low emissions and electric vehicles? We're not seeing that. You know, the union is saying they're not even seeing a production car being produced after December 2019. So that's the real alarm bell here. And we do know that there's big rumblings at General Motors as well. Mary Barra at the last earnings meeting has offered to cut or pledged to cut $6.5 billion in GM expenses. That counts around the world. They're also hit by a slowdown. The auto industry in China is in a slump. We're seeing a plateau of production in the U.S. over the next couple of years. So all these are leading to a big shift in economics. And you get the sense that this is what we're hearing this morning is the tip of an iceberg, that there's been lots of these negotiations when you're talking about money moving back and forth, where to put your capital investment. And let's not forget a question that David Cochran was touching on as well, the big political question of how much influence does Donald Trump and his repatriation of a lot of U.S. industry back onto U.S. soil.
As we talk about the broader implications of all of this, given the numbers of spin-off jobs affected by any shutdown, the study from 2015 paints a pretty devastating picture.
Yes, it sure does. You know, when you consider that there's 2,500 jobs directly impacted by this, there's thousands of feeder jobs, and this is a company that was there since McLaughlin, as you mentioned. That was a horse and buggy company way back over 100 years. So there's a lot of entrenched supplier feeds. If we take a look at a couple of examples as to how many or how big an impact this will have on Oshawa in particular, 29,000 jobs in the auto sector could be directly affected by this. 30% of the parts used in General Motors in Oshawa, that was once the biggest auto plant in Canada, is made in Canada. The vast majority of that right in Ontario, and that will be $1 billion in revenue just from this plant to provincial and federal coffers. So this is a big deal, and a lot of people, particularly in Oshawa, but around Ontario and even Canada, will be paying close attention to this.
We certainly will, and we'll be back to look in the next hour or two, any market reactions, seeing if the sector responds at all. Scott, thank you very much. Megan Fitzpatrick is our reporter. We're going to be covering things from right there on the scene. She's just in front of the plant in Oshawa, that central hub for the industry and for the community. What is the latest information that you are getting there this morning, Megan?
Yeah, Heather, it's pretty quiet here right now, actually. We haven't had a chance to come in contact with any workers here yet, so we're awaiting that to try and grab people to find out what they're being told, what they know. But what we do know is that there's a lot of anxiety in this community here this morning. Oshawa's Mayor John Henry just a few minutes ago said the weather here this morning matches the mood. It's dark and it's gloomy, and a lot of people are awaiting this announcement with anxiety from GM about the future, the fate of this plant behind me, where, as you mentioned, thousands of people work. The union that represents the workers here, we know that they're sitting down with GM this morning. All they know at this point is they've been told there is no product allocation for this plant beyond December 2019. What that exactly means is what a lot of people will be watching for this morning. Will this plant be closing permanently? Will jobs be lost permanently? What is going to happen? GM last night said they had no comment to CBC News, so they weren't shedding much light on the situation here. And the mayor himself telling us this morning that he's been left in the dark as well, that he's just hearing things from the media. He did not get a heads up from GM, which he said, too, obviously was a bit surprising to him, given how important this plan is and the relationship between Oshawa and the company. He said, too, how they're really emphasizing that this is not just a local story for people in Oshawa. This is a story that will affect people far beyond this city. Let's take a listen to what he told CBC last night.
It's not just the city of Oshawa. This is a story about a place where cars get built, but not everybody that works in the plant lives in Oshawa. So this is going to affect communities across Ontario.
And he has been talking, too, just about the long history of GM in the city. It's been here for more than 100 years. This specific plant in operation since the 1950s. And so some people saying this morning, Heather, if these jobs are lost, if this plant closed, there certainly will be shock, worry, anxiety, but also some people saying a sense of betrayal, too, from this company. And some are vowing to fight. If this plant is going to close, they want to fight this. That was what NDP MPP Jennifer French was telling CBC. She represents this riding. Let's take a listen to what she was saying.
We will be in the fight together. Oshawa is always up for a good fight, and we'll give it to them. And hopefully the province and the feds will be in it with us.
And we will be watching for political reaction throughout the morning, too, Heather. We know that Premier Doug Ford is set to speak to reporters at Queen's Park this morning after question period, quite likely because of the expected announcement here today in Oshawa.